After the recent spat between Washington and Lagos, it was time to catch up with Ademola and get his view on why tensions had been steadily rising. In this episode, we look into some of those reasons. The vacuum created after 2011, when the West took out Gaddafi, is one such reason. On the one hand, it stands as a reminder and a threat to African nations if they choose to espouse the idea of Pan-Africanism. On the other hand, it also shows African nations that they will never truly be free until they cut off the hands of colonialism that continue to steal resources while also throttling African continental prosperity. Thank you, Ademola, for your time. This is Two and a Mic.
Dung weche pek kod welo mabiro e Two and a Mic. Dung parodit kod jok mawuoye Two and a Mic. Seche tin sud buta wawinji e Two and a Mic. Wala wachokre wabed piny bi wawinje ero chako momit ndi Two and a Mic podcast makende.
I'm joined again by Ademola from Lagos in Nigeria, and we're going to talk about a topic which is quite topical at the moment, in the sense that there appears to be some tension between the White House and Trump and President Tinubu in Abuja. Can you give us a bit of background as to why this may have developed? And of course, welcome, Ademola.
Thank you very much, Zach. Of course, there's a rising level of insecurity in Nigeria because, this has been existing for a period of, over 10 years. The Boko Haram insurgency started around 2009. But in my opinion, from my perspective, the problem is that the insurgency has been politicized, right? I'm not ruling out the fact that there is insurgency in Nigeria. The problem is that it has been politicized. The Boko Haram started in around 2009 as just a group of bandwagon who, in the name of Islam, tried to build an Islamic caliphate. There are so many people, even Muslims in northern Nigeria, who do not subscribe to this, very terrorist ideology. And not only have Christians been victims, of course, they've been the major victims. There are also a lot of Muslims. Nigeria is a very, very religiously sensitive society because we are 50% Muslims, 50% Christians. So it's always very dicey to talk about issue like this in statistics because, while the Christians are also, the biggest victims of all of this, a lot of Muslims, the Hausas, the indigenous people are also victims of, ethnic cleansing by invaders who are trying to build an Islamic utopia. It's a very, very serious and a sensitive issue, but I do not think that it is beyond the capacity of the Nigerian state to resolve. The issue of security is a domestic issue, right? It is an issue that is one of the reasons why the government exists. The reason why the government exists is to protect the lives and properties of the citizens. So if our government cannot provide the lives and our lives and properties, it is not the job of Donald Trump or the White House to rectify that. It is the responsibility of the Nigerian people to demand accountability from the government, right? So I want President Tinubu to see. I really wish that, of course, there's one day when a mass people uprising will boot out this government and their corrupt, colleagues. But I really want this government out. But I do not think I want the government out through the ground troops of Pentagon. I do not want my country to degenerate into a war-torn territory where two world powers are fighting over mineral resources. I think that the issue of security also, points to the fact that Nigerians have a responsibility in, their own nation building. How have we gotten to this position that we have gotten to? Nigerian army is one of the biggest and, one of the best army in Africa. The local insurgency is not something that is beyond the Nigerian state. If Donald Trump actually wants to help us, he should name and shame, because many of all these financial transactions that goes through the financiers of terrorism goes through American banks. They have all of this intelligence to review these politicians and these religious fanatics who are behind the funding of these terrorists, because they have the data. They have the data to expose them.
Bringing up one of the points that you made before, because there are a number of sources where I went to in preparing for this, and there's one project called the Emerging Alkebulan. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly. And they refer to a data index called the Global Terrorism Index, where they mentioned that more than 80% of Boko Haram's victims are Muslims, because they attack communities that reject their own Boko Haram's ideology. So this backdrop that Trump has created to try to point out that the aggressions that are taking place are mainly prioritizing or targeting Christians is yet another falsehood that he's trying to create to bring up, I imagine, a certain amount of political furore back in Washington, so that he can justify extending his, should we say, military arm elsewhere or further in Africa.
So it's very important to mention that this issue of the Christian genocide in Nigeria, I mean, it has been going on for over 10 years, right? And so this issue of Christian genocide in Nigeria started when the Vice President of Nigeria, Kashim Shettima, he gave a speech at the United Nations General Assembly in defense of the people of Palestine, where he said the people of Palestine are not a collateral damage for a civilization finding its meaning. So after that speech was made, I mean, that's one of the few times that Nigeria has made a very firm stand on international issues. So after that speech was made, we are a lot of attacks in Nigeria. I mean, that there's a Nigerian genocide, a Christian genocide. Of course, Washington again is weaponizing Christianity to justify their colonial agenda. They actually started talking about all of all these things when their little baby Israel was attacked diplomatically by the Vice President of Nigeria. So it doesn't also rule out the fact that Nigeria has security issues, right? And it is the responsibility of our people to resolve them. So we are not going to involve Israel or the United States or any foreign army. We are not going to entertain any foreign occupation on our land.
Yeah, and people need to see exactly what it is that Trump is trying to achieve. So by pursuing this apparent goal to protect Christians in Nigeria, what he's actually doing is solidifying his evangelical base back in the United States. It helps him out. This is somebody who's perhaps going to try to make an unprecedented run at a third term in office somehow. And so if he can get the support of these Christian radical groups in the USA, that's obviously going to help his plan. But on the basis of some of the things that you've also said and some other things that I've read about, you mentioned Boko Haram coming essentially out in 2009. But again, referring to the Emerging Alkebulan, they talk about the rise of well-resourced illegal mining and mineral trafficking operations as one of the main reasons. Obviously, corruption. The rise of armed groups filling a vacuum, but also what is quite interesting, and they mention, is the proliferation of weapons after the fall of Gaddafi in 2011. Do you have any light to shed on the influence of non-African nations' participation in bringing Gaddafi down, the vacuum of power that has then led to the situation in Libya being what it is, and perhaps what follow-on consequences that may have had for Nigeria?
Thank you very much, Zach. I mean, this also points to the fact that the African Union is a very useless institution filled with old people, presidents of various African countries who have refused to leave power. So it's just an echo chamber, the executive arm of the foreign policy of the European Union and the American Congress. It's very shameful that the African Union was not able to defend Gaddafi and his government and the integrity and the sovereignty of the people of Libya. Because the airstrikes and the subsequent fall of the regime in Libya opened the door to a lot of occupation. Many of all these European countries now develop confidence that okay, Africa can be occupied. It was a litmus test to test how far they can go, and we saw the subsequent repercussions of the invasion of Libya, the immigration crisis, the population explosion. Because they create the problem and they complain about immigration because many of all these countries that you've bombed, you've destroyed their government, you've displaced, they are coming right to your territories. So, to solve the problem of immigration is not by making draconian immigration laws. It is by fixing, your foreign policy, right? Your foreign policy to ensure that people are, a lot of people are occupying. You look at Libya today. Libya has become a war-torn failed society where European governments, Russia, China, all of them are fighting over the oil, fighting over mineral resources. The country doesn't have a president. There's no sound constitutional democracy like every other African government would have imagined. So it's very important that Africa draw lessons and inspiration from Libya, because welcoming foreign troops in a country like Nigeria is not learning from history. It is creating the circumstances for another Libya, Ibeku, to happen.
Yeah, and it's important that you make these points because people have to realize Ivory Coast has expelled French troops. So has Chad. So has Senegal. And we're familiar, obviously, with what Burkina Faso and Mali have done. And I've followed also a Dr. Donna Oriowo, and she has mentioned that some of what is happening in Nigeria at the moment is a move to appease France and then need to obtain natural resources for their own nuclear energy industry, because Niger has also nationalized its own uranium assets, and that is creating problems for France as well. So what it seems as though is that a lot of these non-African nations can see the developing Pan-African movement spreading around certain parts of Africa, at least. And they appear to be afraid that they are no longer going to have the influence that they had before in simply taking what they wanted. And this may be an attempt to put a few more US boots on the ground to try to then assert their influence in some of these other countries too, and appease France in the process. Do you see that as being one of the aims here as well?
When you look at the political events that has been occurring the past few years, especially in the Sahel, you realize that Francafrique has been torn down by the resistance in the countries in the Sahel, Niger, Burkina Faso, Mali. French troops have been driven out. American base in Agadez has been driven out. And the best place to relocate all these things is Nigeria. So many of all these spurious claims and this hypocritical defense of a Christian genocide in Nigeria is just one of all these ploys to bring religion to the fore while implementing their colonial agenda. So you can remember when the coup in Niger happened, the government of President Tinubu was willing to send troops to liberate Niger in favor of the puppet regime of France. So it's very important to see foreign hands at play and to see that even in Nigeria, we are not free from neo-colonial rule. So it's very important that Nigerian people maintain revolutionary vigilance and observe that colonialism doesn't necessarily have to come with boots on the ground. It comes through client regimes. It comes through fake democracies like the democracies of President Tinubu and their colleagues in Cameroon, all over Africa.
Yeah, and we should also remember that recently there was an American senior military advisor who expressed that President Ibrahim Traore was, and they started saying all sorts of silly things about how he was misusing funds and so on in Burkina Faso. And then within a day or so, there was perhaps the 22nd or the 23rd assassination attempt on President Traore, which obviously failed, thankfully. But they mentioned that they had, among the number of those who participated in the assassination attempt, they had captured some American mercenaries. Since then, it seems that the criticism of President Traore has at least not been quite so publicly vocal. But these kinds of efforts to destabilize African nations has existed, obviously, ever since the days going back to Thomas Sankara and also before. And it appears, obviously, that the greed of some of these countries knows no bounds. But for you, inside Nigeria, and you obviously are very well aware of what's happening in some of the other countries, you are yourself a very proud Pan-Africanist. Do you finally see that with the coming together of so many of these African nations, at least in the west of Africa, that maybe a tide has turned and this concept of Pan-Africanism can truly take off finally?
The unification of Africa is just what happens after the liberation of Africa. So if you remember the 60s, you remember Nkrumah saying in his slogans and rallies, Pan-Africanism means the liberation and the unification of Africa. So before Africa has to be unified, Africa has to be liberated. So before we can have a confederation like we have in an example like the AES, it's very important that we liberate ourselves from neo-colonial regimes and sham democracies of them, Tinubu's, regimes of people like Paul Biya, who has been ruling for 42 years, regimes of people like Museveni. It is after them that we can build a meaningful Pan-African intimacy. But at the moment now, I see that some revolutionary events are unfolding, and I'm really very, very proud of the events happening in Burkina Faso, happening in Niger. It's just an example to show the world that really African can actually make our own decisions.
Yeah, and always prioritizing their own local people and their own local interests. And also along those lines, the power and influence of ECOWAS in Abuja is also declining. So that perhaps is also a part of the process of liberation.
ECOWAS, like the African Union, is another echo chamber. I mean, the president of ECOWAS, I think President Tinubu has, the president ECOWAS, I mean, the last time I checked, the president of ECOWAS was President Tinubu. So I'm just thinking about the kind of policies they make on behalf of African people. ECOWAS, African Union, and all these organizations, they don't speak for African people. They speak for African elites who have hijacked the government across the continent.
And an example of the hijacking, just one final point from my side, and which a lot of people perhaps don't really recognize and understand. The minimum wage in Nigeria means that a person would take home $600 a year, whereas legislators, people who work in parliament, the political elites, these people earn $150,000 a year. That disparity, that level of disparity is absolutely scandalous. So people looking at that can obviously understand why there is a lot of dissatisfaction with the political elites in Nigeria, and why simply they just cannot be trusted to represent the interests of their people.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Zach. Nigerian politicians are the highest paid in the world. Nigerian politicians earn more than Donald Trump. Nigerian senators earn more than American politicians. So, I mean, this is a country that is the poverty capital of the world. So it is this inequality and this income disparity and this oppression that Nigerian governments have to really tackle, because the governance is the root cause of insecurity. A government that is failing its people economically. This government has failed on every metric with which you can use to measure a functioning government. So, like I said earlier during the beginning of this podcast, that the onus still lies on the Nigerian people to create a future for themselves.
Yeah, and one final point for me, we've seen in recent years in Kenya how Generation Z has stepped up and pushed forward its discontent, as it were, with the Kenyan government. Do you see Gen Z also being equally active in Nigeria? And yeah, are you at all involved in that movement?
Thank you very much, Zach. I belong to a political organization in Nigeria, with which we do some grassroots sensitization and mobilization. I think the influence of the revolutionary wave that is blown from Kenya to Tanzania to Morocco, the consciousness, the level of consciousness is also rising in Nigeria, because following this Trump and President Tinubu brouhaha, the people have been asking serious questions, be holding the government to account. And I mean, it's very interesting to see that for the first time in a few times, Nigerians are actually asking their government the important questions.
Thank you very much, Ademola. It's always educational speaking with you and listening to your insights.
Thank you very much. From Lagos with love.
Wonderful. I wish you all the best, brother, and speak to you soon.
Yeah, thank you, Zach. You have a lovely time in Berlin.
And a mic.